In 476 AD, a barbarian king walked into Rome. He sat on the throne of the greatest empire the world had ever seen. And he sent the imperial crown back to Constantinople with a simple message. There is no emperor here anymore. Just like that, after 1,000 years, Rome was gone. Or was it? Because here is what they never tell you in history class. Rome did not fall in a day. It did not fall in a year. It did not even fall in a century. The greatest empire in human history collapsed slowly, over hundreds of years, from the inside out. Not because the barbarians were too strong, but because Rome had become too weak to save itself. This is the real story of how Rome fell. And it is far more complicated and far more fascinating than anything you were taught in school. Before we talk about how Rome fell, we need to understand what Rome was at its peak. Because the scale of the Roman Empire is genuinely difficult to comprehend. At its maximum extent under Emperor Trajan in 117 AD, Rome controlled territory stretching from the Scottish Highlands in the north to the deserts of Mesopotamia in the east. From the Atlantic coast of Portugal to the borders of Persia, an empire of approximately 5 million square kilometers. A population of 50 to 70 million people, roughly 20% of the entire human population of the Earth. It contained within its borders more different languages, religions, climates, economies, and cultures than any previous political entity in human history. And it held them all together with three tools. Roman law, a legal system so sophisticated that it still forms the foundation of legal codes across Europe today. Roman roads, 400,000 kilometers of paved roads connecting every corner of the empire, still visible in satellite images today. And the Roman legion, the most devastating professional military force the ancient world had ever produced. This was what fell. The seeds of Rome's collapse were planted at the very moment of its greatest triumph. The problem was simple. The bigger Rome got, the harder Rome was to defend. Every new province added to the empire added new borders to protect. New borders required new legions. New legions required more money. More money required more taxation. More taxation required more efficient administration. And more efficient administration required more bureaucrats, who also needed to be paid. The Roman Empire was, at its core, a military machine. It paid for itself through conquest, the plunder of new territories, the taxation of new populations, the enslaved people captured in new campaigns. But conquest has a natural limit. When you reach the point where the cost of conquering new territory exceeds the value of what you gain, expansion stops being profitable. Rome reached that point under Trajan. His successor Hadrian, who built his famous wall across northern Britain, understood this. He stopped expanding and started consolidating. But consolidation meant the river of conquest revenue dried up, and Rome had bills to pay. Rome's financial system in the 3rd century AD was in serious trouble. The empire's expenses were enormous. The army, the bureaucracy, the grain dole that fed Rome's urban poor, the building programs that kept the population loyal and employed. The revenue was not keeping pace. Roman emperors found a solution. They debased the currency. The silver denarius, Rome's standard coin, had been approximately 90% silver under Augustus. By the reign of Emperor Gallienus in the 260s AD, it was less than 5% silver. The rest was bronze. What happened next was exactly what always happens when you flood an economy with debased currency. Inflation. Prices rose dramatically. Merchants stopped accepting debased coins and demanded payment in kind, in grain, in gold, in goods. The sophisticated money economy that had connected Rome's provinces began breaking down. Trade contracted. Tax revenues fell further, which led to more debasement, which led to more inflation. The spiral was vicious. An empire that had functioned on trust, trust in its currency, trust in its institutions, was losing that trust from the inside. Between 235 and 284 AD, a period historians call the crisis of the 3rd century, the Roman Empire came terrifyingly close to complete collapse. In those 50 years, Rome had approximately 50 different emperors. Most of them lasted less than a year. Most of them were assassinated by their own soldiers. The pattern was grimly repetitive. A general would be acclaimed emperor by his troops. He would march on Rome. He would take power. Another general's troops would declare their man emperor. Civil war would follow. One would win, then be killed by his own soldiers. Then the cycle would repeat. While Rome fought itself internally, its external enemies took full advantage. The Sassanid Persian Empire, the powerful successor to the ancient Parthian kingdom, attacked from the east. In 260 AD, the unthinkable happened. The Emperor Valerian, the ruler of Rome, the most powerful man in the world, was captured in battle by the Persian king Shapur I, a Roman emperor. Taken prisoner, Shapur reportedly used Valerian as a human footstool when mounting his horse. Rome had never experienced anything like this. In 284 AD, a soldier named Diocletian seized the throne. And instead of following the pattern of the crisis, ruling briefly, fighting rivals, dying violently, he did something revolutionary. He ruled for 21 years, and he reformed everything. Diocletian understood that one man could not govern an empire of Rome's size effectively. He created the Tetrarchy, a system of 4 co-emperors, 2 senior and 2 junior, each responsible for a different region of the empire. He massively expanded the bureaucracy, creating more administrative layers to manage the empire's complexity. He reformed the currency, introducing new standardized coins. He reformed the army, increasing its size and reorganizing it into mobile strike forces that could respond quickly to threats anywhere on the frontier. He tried to control inflation through the Edict on Maximum Prices, setting legal price ceilings on hundreds of goods and services. The edict failed. Merchants simply stopped selling rather than sell below cost. But the attempt showed how seriously Diocletian took the economic crisis. He stabilized the empire. He did not save it, because the problems he was solving were symptoms. The disease was something deeper. In 312 AD, the Emperor Constantine fought a battle at the Milvian Bridge outside Rome. Before the battle, according to his own account, he saw a vision in the sky, a cross or a Chi-Rho symbol, with the words "In this sign conquer." He won the battle, and he attributed his victory to the Christian God. Constantine became the first Roman emperor to convert to Christianity. He issued the Edict of Milan in 313, making Christianity legal throughout the empire. He funded the building of Christian churches on a massive scale. He moved the imperial capital from Rome to a new city on the Bosphorus, Constantinople, which he designed as a Christian city from its foundation. The impact of these decisions on Rome's trajectory was enormous. Resources that had funded temples to Jupiter, Mars, and the traditional Roman gods were redirected to Christian churches. The relationship between the emperor and the military, previously mediated by traditional Roman religious rituals, was restructured around Christian ceremony. The intellectual and cultural identity of the Roman elite began shifting from classical Greco-Roman culture toward Christian theology. Rome was becoming something different. Whether that was salvation or transformation, historians still debate. In 395 AD, Emperor Theodosius died. He left the empire to his 2 sons. Arcadius took the eastern half, ruling from Constantinople. Honorius took the western half, ruling eventually from Ravenna in northern Italy. This division, which had been building for decades through the Tetrarchy and its successors, became permanent, and the difference between the 2 halves was immediately apparent. The Eastern Roman Empire, what we now call the Byzantine Empire, was wealthy. Constantinople sat at the crossroads of the most important trade routes in the ancient world, connecting Europe to Asia, the Black Sea to the Mediterranean. Its tax revenues were enormous. Its bureaucracy was sophisticated. Its army was well-funded. The Western Roman Empire was poor by comparison. Its economy was less developed. Its tax base was eroding. Its borders were longer and harder to defend. Its army was increasingly dependent on barbarian soldiers, Goths, Vandals, Franks, who were recruited because there were not enough Romans willing to fight. The East would survive for another 1,000 years. The West had less than a century left. When we say barbarians destroyed Rome, we need to be precise about who those people actually were. The word barbarian comes from the Greek barbaros, meaning foreigner, someone who does not speak Greek. Romans used it for anyone outside the empire. But the Goths, Vandals, Franks, Huns, and other peoples who eventually overwhelmed the Western Empire were not primitive savages. Many of them had been in close contact with Rome for generations. Thousands of them served in the Roman army, rising to senior command positions. They traded with Rome. They adopted Roman goods, Roman customs, some Roman religious practices. Many of their leaders spoke Latin. They were not trying to destroy Roman civilization. Most of them wanted to be part of it. What they wanted was land inside the empire where they could settle safely, farm, and raise their families. Because something was pushing them from behind. Something that Rome's generals were only beginning to understand. The Huns. The Huns were a nomadic people from the Eurasian steppe, the vast grassland stretching from Hungary to China. They appeared on the edges of the Roman world in the 370s AD, and the peoples they encountered had never seen anything like them. Their cavalry tactics were unlike anything in the Western world. They could fire arrows with extraordinary accuracy at full gallop, a skill developed over lifetimes of riding and hunting on the steppe. They moved with terrifying speed, appearing suddenly, striking, disappearing before any conventional force could respond. The Goths, who lived north of the Danube on Rome's frontier, met the Huns first, and the Goths, who were themselves formidable warriors, were terrified. In 376 AD, an enormous Gothic population, estimates range from 100,000 to 200,000 people, appeared on the northern bank of the Danube River. They sent messengers to the Roman Emperor Valens. They asked to be let in, not to raid, not to conquer, to escape the Huns. Valens made a decision that would have catastrophic consequences. He said yes. The Goths crossed the Danube into Roman territory in 376 AD. What followed was a catastrophe of Roman administration. The Roman officials responsible for managing the Gothic settlement were corrupt and incompetent. They cheated the Goths on promised food supplies. They extracted bribes. They enslaved Gothic children. The Goths, who had crossed the Danube as refugees seeking Roman protection, were being treated as conquered slaves. They rebelled. In 378 AD, the Emperor Valens led a Roman army against the Gothic rebels near the city of Adrianople in modern Turkey. He did not wait for reinforcements from the Western Emperor. He attacked. The Battle of Adrianople on August 9, 378 AD was one of the worst defeats in Roman military history. The Gothic cavalry, which Valens had not properly accounted for, smashed into the Roman flanks. The Roman legions, caught in a formation they could not maneuver out of, were slaughtered. Emperor Valens was killed. 2/3 of the Eastern Roman army was destroyed. Rome's military invincibility, the foundation of everything, had been shattered. The Goths were inside the empire, and Rome could not push them out. As the Western Empire crumbled, one man held it together longer than anyone had any right to expect. His name was Stilicho. He was half Roman. His mother was Roman, and half Vandal. His father was a Vandal cavalry officer who had risen through Roman service. He became the most powerful general in the Western Empire, the effective ruler behind the weak Emperor Honorius. Stilicho was a military genius. He fought the Visigoths under their king Alaric to a standstill multiple times, using a combination of battlefield skill and political negotiation that kept the worst at bay. He repelled a massive invasion of Italy by a Gothic king named Radagaisus in 406 AD, defeating an army that ancient sources claim numbered 400,000. He maintained the Western Empire's coherence at a time when it was coming apart at every seam. And then in 408 AD, the Emperor Honorius, paranoid, incompetent, easily manipulated, had Stilicho executed on charges of treason. The charges were almost certainly false. The result was catastrophic. The one man capable of defending the Western Empire was gone. 2 years later, Rome was sacked for the first time in 800 years. On August 24th, 410 AD, the Visigoth king Alaric entered Rome. His forces sacked the city for 3 days. They took gold, silver, jewels, silk, the accumulated wealth of centuries. They took enslaved people, including Galla Placidia, the emperor's own sister. What they did not do was destroy the city. The great monuments, the Colosseum, the Forum, the Pantheon, were left standing. Churches were specifically spared. By the standards of ancient warfare, it was not even a particularly brutal sack. But the psychological impact on the Roman world was devastating. Rome, the eternal city, the city that had never fallen, the city that had stood for over 1,000 years, had been taken by barbarians. Saint Jerome, writing from Bethlehem when he heard the news, wrote words that capture the ancient world's disbelief. He described the city that had conquered the world as itself conquered. If Rome can fall, he wrote, what is safe? It was a question the ancient world could not answer. Because the answer was nothing. While the Visigoths settled in southwestern Gaul and began integrating into the crumbling Western Empire, another barbarian people were making a move that would prove even more damaging. The Vandals. The Vandals had crossed the Rhine in 406 AD along with other peoples, pushed by the same chain reaction that the Huns had started. They moved through Gaul, into Spain. Then, in 429 AD, they crossed the Strait of Gibraltar into North Africa, under their king Gaiseric, one of the shrewdest political minds of the 5th century. The Vandals swept across Roman North Africa. In 439 AD, they took Carthage. This was not just a military disaster. It was an economic catastrophe. North Africa was the breadbasket of the Western Roman Empire, the source of the grain that fed Rome's population and the tax revenue that paid Rome's army. With North Africa gone, the Western Empire's financial situation went from desperate to terminal, and Gaiseric was not finished. In 455 AD, he sailed his fleet to Rome. The second sack lasted 14 days. This one was thorough. The Vandals took everything that the Visigoths had left. By the mid-5th century, the Western Roman Emperor was a figurehead. Real power was held by barbarian military commanders, men called Magister Militum, master of soldiers, who placed emperors on the throne and removed them when convenient. The parade of Western emperors in the final decades is almost darkly comic. Between 455 and 476 AD, the final 21 years of the Western Empire, there were 9 different emperors. Most lasted 2 or 3 years. Most were killed by the barbarian generals who had put them in power. One emperor, Libius Severus, was so completely under the control of the general Ricimer that historians debate whether he had any actual authority at all. Another, Olybrius, lasted 7 months. The empire that had produced Augustus, Trajan, and Marcus Aurelius was now producing disposable figureheads whose names most Romans probably did not bother to learn. The institution of emperor had not been destroyed by barbarian invasion. It had been hollowed out from within by corruption, by military dependence on barbarian soldiers whose loyalty was to their commanders, not to Rome, and by the complete collapse of any legitimate succession system. In the middle of the 5th century, the most feared man in the world was not a Roman emperor. He was a Hun. Attila, who became the sole ruler of the Hunnic Empire around 445 AD after reportedly having his own brother killed, was the most powerful individual in the Western world for approximately a decade. His empire stretched from the Rhine River in the west to somewhere beyond the Caspian Sea in the east. He extracted enormous tribute from both the Eastern and Western Roman empires, essentially taxing Rome for the privilege of not being destroyed. Ancient sources describe him as short, broad-shouldered, with a large head and small eyes. He dressed simply. He ate from wooden plates while his guests ate from silver. He was utterly ruthless and completely without sentiment in political matters. He invaded Gaul in 451 AD with an army that ancient sources claim numbered in the hundreds of thousands. He was stopped at the Battle of the Catalaunian Plains, one of the largest battles of the ancient world, by a coalition of Romans and Visigoths fighting together. He then invaded Italy. He sacked cities. He destroyed everything in his path. He turned back before reaching Rome. Nobody knows exactly why. A year later, he was dead, found in a pool of blood on his wedding night. Cause of death uncertain to this day. As the Western Empire disintegrated, the Eastern Empire, ruled from Constantinople, not only survived but thrived. Why? Geography was the first reason. Constantinople sat on a peninsula, protected on 3 sides by water and on the 4th by the most formidable defensive walls in the ancient world. The Theodosian walls, built in the early 5th century, were a double-wall system with towers every 70 meters, a moat in front and a terrace between the walls. No army successfully breached them for 1,000 years. The second reason was economic. Constantinople controlled the Bosphorus, the narrow strait connecting the Black Sea to the Mediterranean. Every ship trading between these two bodies of water paid dues to Constantinople. The city was an automatic tax collector, extracting wealth from trade without needing to conquer territory. The third reason was administrative. The Eastern Empire had a more developed, more literate bureaucracy that could function even when individual emperors were weak. The fourth reason was the Hunnic threat paradoxically helped the East. Attila extracted tribute from the East, but focused his destructive campaigns on the West. The East paid. The West burned. In 475 AD, a Roman general named Orestes overthrew the reigning Western emperor and placed his own teenage son on the throne. The boy's name was Romulus Augustulus. Romulus, the name of Rome's legendary founder. Augustus, the title of Rome's first emperor. The names were perhaps history's cruelest irony, because Romulus Augustulus was the last Western Roman emperor. He was approximately 15 years old. He had no military experience, no political base, no real power of any kind. His father Orestes held the actual authority, and Orestes held it only as long as his barbarian troops supported him. Those troops had a demand. They wanted land in Italy, 1/3 of Italy's agricultural land, to be distributed among them as payment for their service. Orestes refused. His troops mutinied. They chose a new leader, a chieftain named Odoacer from the Germanic Syrian tribe. Odoacer's forces killed Orestes. Then they marched to Ravenna where the teenage emperor was waiting. On September 4th, 476 AD, Romulus Augustulus surrendered to Odoacer. Odoacer could have killed him. He chose not to. Ancient sources suggest he felt pity for the boy, noting his youth and his harmlessness. He sent Romulus Augustulus into exile in Campania, in southern Italy, with a comfortable pension. The boy emperor disappeared from history. Then Odoacer did the thing that made 476 AD significant not just as a military event, but as a symbolic one. He gathered the imperial regalia, the crown, the purple robes, the symbols of Western Roman imperial authority, and he sent them to Constantinople, to the Eastern Emperor Zeno, with a message. There is no need for a Western emperor, Odoacer said. One emperor, in Constantinople, is sufficient for the entire empire. Zeno accepted the regalia. He gave Odoacer the title of patrician, a Roman honorific, acknowledging his rule over Italy. And just like that, with paperwork and diplomacy rather than fire and blood, the Western Roman Empire ended. Not with a battle, with a letter. Here is where the story gets complicated. Because in a very real sense, Rome did not fall in 476 AD. The Roman Senate continued to function in Rome for decades after Odoacer took power. Roman law continued to govern daily life across the former Western Empire. Latin continued to be spoken and would evolve over the following centuries into Italian, French, Spanish, Portuguese, and Romanian. The Catholic Church, which had become the dominant institution of the late Roman Empire, continued to use Latin to organize itself along Roman administrative lines and to preserve Roman learning through its monasteries. Odoacer himself, the man who ended the Western Empire, governed Italy using Roman administrative structures, employed Roman bureaucrats, and presented himself as a Roman-style ruler. His successor Theodoric the Ostrogoth, who killed Odoacer in 493 AD, did the same. Theodoric governed Italy for 33 years. He maintained Roman law. He employed the great Roman philosopher Boethius as his master of offices. He corresponded with the Eastern Emperor in perfectly formal Latin. He was a Gothic king ruling a Roman state using Roman tools. Was that Rome? Or was it something new? For centuries, historians have argued about what really caused Rome to fall. Edward Gibbon, who wrote The Monumental Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire in the 18th century, blamed Christianity. He argued that Christian values, humility, pacifism, rejection of worldly glory, undermined the martial virtues that had made Rome great. Other historians blamed lead poisoning, arguing that Romans' extensive use of lead pipes and lead-lined cookware poisoned the ruling class, reducing intelligence and fertility over generations. Others blamed climate change. Evidence suggests a cooling period and increased volcanic activity in the 5th and 6th centuries reduced agricultural yields and disrupted the economy. Others blame the simple military explanation: too many borders, not enough soldiers, not enough money. Others point to political dysfunction. The inability to create a stable succession system meant constant civil war that bled the empire of resources. The modern scholarly consensus, if there is one, is that Rome fell because of everything simultaneously: military pressure, economic collapse, political dysfunction, climate stress, disease. The Antonine Plague of the 2nd century and the Plague of Cyprian in the 3rd killed millions. No single cause, a system failure. When enough things go wrong simultaneously, even the greatest empire in history cannot hold together. One factor in Rome's collapse that is often underestimated is disease. The Roman Empire was, by the standards of the ancient world, extremely well connected. Roads linking every province, sea routes connecting every coastline, soldiers moving from one end of the empire to the other. This connectivity was Rome's greatest strength. It was also its greatest vulnerability. When disease appeared, Rome's road networks spread it with terrifying efficiency. The Antonine Plague, which struck the empire between 165 and 180 AD, killed an estimated 5 million people, including the Emperor Lucius Verus. The Plague of Cyprian, which struck between 249 and 262 AD, was even more devastating. Ancient sources describe 5,000 people dying per day in Rome alone at its peak. The total death toll may have reached as high as 25 million across the empire. The demographic impact was catastrophic. Farms were abandoned because there were not enough people to work them. Tax revenues fell because the taxable population was smaller. The army struggled to recruit because the military-age male population had been devastated. Disease did not destroy Rome, but it weakened every system that held Rome together: the economy, the military, the administration, simultaneously and repeatedly. The Roman legion had been the foundation of everything. The most effective military force in the ancient world, disciplined, professional, devastating in battle, capable of building roads and fortifications as well as fighting. By the 5th century, it barely resembled what it had been. The 3rd century crisis had forced Rome to reorganize its military dramatically. Diocletian and his successors created two types of forces: the limitanei, border troops stationed permanently on the frontier, and the comitatenses, mobile field armies that could be moved to wherever the threat was greatest. This was tactically sound. But the limitanei, permanently stationed, with families and farms near their posts, gradually became less soldiers and more border militia. They fought to defend their own land, not Rome's. And the field armies became increasingly barbarian in composition. Barbarian soldiers were cheaper to recruit and often more effective fighters than Roman citizens who had grown up in the relative security of the empire's interior. But their loyalty was to their commanders, and through their commanders to whoever was paying them. When the money ran out, and it frequently did, their loyalty ran out with it. An army that fights for pay is fundamentally different from an army that fights for Rome. When the barbarian kingdoms settled into the former Western Empire, what they found was not ruins. They found roads, still functional, still the fastest way to move people and goods across Europe. They found cities, reduced in population, some partially abandoned, but still standing, still organized along Roman lines. They found law, the Roman legal codes that the Visigoth, Burgundian, and other kingdoms adapted for their own use rather than replacing entirely. They found the church, the most organized institution in the Western world, preserving Latin literacy, Roman administrative traditions, and classical learning, in its monasteries. And they found a population that still thought of itself as Roman. The peasants farming in France and Spain and Italy in the 6th century did not think of themselves as living in the aftermath of a collapsed empire. They thought of themselves as Romans, ruled now by Gothic or Frankish kings instead of Roman emperors, but Roman nonetheless. Identity is remarkably resilient. Rome, the political entity, had ended. Rome as a cultural identity, as a way of organizing society, thinking about law, practicing religion, speaking, and writing, continued for centuries. It continues in some forms today. The period after Rome's fall is often called the Dark Ages. The implication is that civilization collapsed, that learning, art, architecture, and sophisticated society disappeared with the Western Empire and did not return for centuries. This is partly true and largely misleading. What was genuinely lost was significant. Long-distance trade contracted dramatically. The sophisticated economic network connecting Britain to Egypt to Mesopotamia within a single political system simply could not function without the infrastructure Rome had maintained. Urban populations collapsed. Cities that had housed tens of thousands shrank to a few thousand. Literacy rates fell. Without the Roman educational system, reading and writing became confined largely to the church. Building in stone virtually ceased in the West for generations. But things continued too. Agriculture continued. People farmed, raised animals, maintained communities. The church continued, preserving learning, maintaining Latin literacy, providing the organizational framework for society. Local governance continued, adapted, reorganized, but functioning. And new things began. The Germanic kingdoms that replaced Rome were not simply Rome with different rulers. They were something new, mixing Roman traditions with Germanic customs to create the cultures that would eventually become France, Germany, England, Spain, and Italy. The Dark Ages were not dark. They were different. In the 6th century, the Eastern Roman Empire made one extraordinary attempt to undo the fall of the West. The Emperor Justinian, who ruled from 527 to 565 AD, was one of the most ambitious rulers in Byzantine history. He had a vision: restore the Roman Empire, reconquer the western provinces that had fallen to the barbarians, make Rome whole again. He had two exceptional generals, Belisarius and Narses, whose military skill was extraordinary. Belisarius reconquered North Africa from the Vandals in 533 AD in a campaign of stunning speed and efficiency. He then invaded Italy, beginning a long, brutal war against the Ostrogoths that lasted nearly 20 years. By 554 AD, Justinian controlled Italy, North Africa, and parts of Spain. The Western Roman Empire, in theory, had been restored. In practice, the reconquest was a disaster. The Italian campaigns were so destructive that they left Italy more devastated than the barbarian kingdoms had. The resources spent on Western reconquest left the Eastern Empire vulnerable to the Persians in the east, to new peoples pressing on the Danube frontier. And within a generation of Justinian's death, Italy was lost again to a new Germanic people called the Lombards. The restoration lasted less than 20 years. The final transformation of the ancient world came from an unexpected direction. In the 630s AD, less than a century after Justinian's attempt to restore the empire, Arab armies erupted out of the Arabian Peninsula carrying a new religion: Islam. Within a generation, they had conquered Syria, Palestine, and Egypt, provinces that had been Roman for 700 years. Within a century, they had swept across North Africa, crossed into Spain, and pushed to the borders of France. The Mediterranean Sea, which Rome had called Mare Nostrum, our sea, was divided. The northern shore remained Christian, Roman in culture, Latin or Greek in language. The southern and eastern shores became Islamic, Arabic in language, Muslim in religion. The unified Mediterranean world that Rome had created, the world where goods, people, and ideas moved freely from one end to the other, was permanently divided. This transformation completed what 476 AD had begun. The Roman world, as a coherent cultural and economic unit, was finished. Something new was beginning. The medieval world. The fall of Rome has been studied obsessively for 15 centuries because people believe it holds lessons about how great powers collapse, about the relationship between military strength and economic health, about what happens when a society stops producing enough of its own soldiers and relies on outsiders to fight its wars, about the danger of currency debasement and inflation, about what happens when political institutions lose legitimacy and rulers are chosen by whoever has the most armed supporters, about the role of disease and climate in shaping political outcomes, about the difference between a civilization's political form, which can fall, and its cultural identity, which can survive even total political collapse. Every generation finds new relevance in Rome's fall. Every generation sees its own situation reflected in the mirror of Rome's decline. Whether those parallels are genuinely instructive or whether each historical moment is too unique for direct comparison, that is a question historians have argued about as long as they have been studying Rome. What is not in question is this: no empire lasts forever. Rome lasted longer than most. And what it left behind, in law, in language, in architecture, in religion, in the very idea of what a civilized society looks like, has never fully disappeared. Stand anywhere in Western Europe today, and you are standing on Rome. The roads that connect European cities often follow routes that Roman engineers planned 2,000 years ago. The legal systems of France, Spain, Italy, Portugal, and their former colonies around the world are descended directly from Roman law. The Latin alphabet that you are reading these words in was Rome's gift to the world. The Romance languages, French, Spanish, Portuguese, Italian, Romanian, are what Latin became after Rome fell, evolving differently in different regions over centuries. The Catholic Church, which still has over 1 billion members, is organized along Roman administrative lines, uses Latin in its formal liturgy, and sits in Rome, the city of the emperors, as its headquarters. Even the Protestant churches that broke from Rome carry Roman institutional DNA. The very concept of Europe as a cultural and political unit distinct from Asia and Africa was shaped by the boundaries of the Roman Empire. The idea that law should be written down, accessible, consistent, and apply equally to all citizens, regardless of how imperfectly Rome actually achieved this, is a Roman idea. Rome fell, but Rome never really ended. On September 4th, 476 AD, a 15-year-old boy handed over a crown and went into comfortable exile. A barbarian king sent the imperial regalia to Constantinople with a polite note, and the Western Roman Empire ended. Not with fire, not with massacre, not with the dramatic last stand that the story deserves. With paperwork, because that is how great empires usually end. Not destroyed from outside, hollowed out from within. The money runs out. The soldiers stop believing in what they are fighting for. The politicians stop caring about anything beyond their own survival. The people at the borders stop seeing any reason to stay on the Roman side. And one day there is no Roman side left. Just a memory. Just ruins. Just roads that still work and laws that still make sense in a language that is still being spoken in 100 different forms by 1 billion different people in countries that did not exist when Rome fell. Just a church in the city of the emperors, still calling itself Roman, still using the language of Caesar. Just the word we still use, civilization, which comes from the Latin civitas. City, Rome's gift. Still here, still standing.